Well, good afternoon. I heard these people up here are awake and everybody else is totally asleep. It's not the end of the day yet. The parties are coming. I mean, you got to wake up. You got to make it to the parties at least, right? So let's try it again. Good afternoon. See, I knew you guys had it in you. See, that you guys are all my peeps. So very cool. A couple things, just real quick housekeeping stuff. Do not block the fire exits. You're either in or you're out. And speaking of, you are in Ballroom C. This is the anything track. You got about 10 seconds to get out of here if this isn't where you want to be, because we're going to lock you in. Just kidding. Seriously. The other thing, of course, cell phones. Silence. Please. I wore boots today just in case. I don't want to have to use them. But if I hear your cell phone, we might. All right. So we are going to talk all about this craziness that we call security and what in the heck are we doing. Our next speaker is going to give you some great perspectives on how we can do things, think about things a little differently. So with that, everybody, Jeff Mann.
Check one, check two, check three. I got an audio. Good afternoon, everyone. Run over here and get my clicker. My name is Jeff Mann. There's my contact information. I love talking to people, corresponding with them on social media and old-fashioned things like email. Feel free to reach out if you have questions, you want to seek guidance. I try to mentor as much as possible. I'm an old-timer. I can't do much these days. I wondered who that was. Thought that was mine. I thought it was a gift for me. Nobody's noticing you. Is this mine? She's not paying attention. Anyway, a little bit about me, just to start off. I've had a very long career. Looking around, this may not work, but I'll try it anyway. Raise your hand if you were born, say, after the year 1982. Okay, I've been doing this stuff longer than you guys have been alive. When I talk in terms of hacker jobs, I go back to about 1982. I had a part-time job in college, helping a state agency try to help people prevent defaulting on their student loans. So I learned something called loan skip tracing. And looking back on it, I realized, I was learning social engineering skills. But you had certain parameters that you were allowed to work with, but you were basically coming up with creative ways of lying to people on the telephone to try to get them to put the delinquent person on the line. So in terms of paying jobs, it's been since about 1984. Was with the government for 13 years. I've been out in the private sector for about 23 years. Currently, I work for a company called Online Business Systems. We're a consulting practice. We do pen testing. We do managed security services. We do some other stuff. The other side of the house is digital transformation. One of my coworkers is here, so plug your ears a minute. I don't know what digital transformation really means. IT services primarily. And they let me have a t-shirt that actually had the name of my talk on it, so I think that's kind of cool. So give my company a hand. They let me come out here and do this kind of stuff. Thank you. A quick confession. Even though I've been in the business all this time, I really have always learned from other people, and that's one of the reasons why I come out here and speak, is because I'm now trying to pay it forward and teach some of the things that I've learned over the years to the next generation or peers or whatever you want to call it. I've been trying to work in a little bit with mental health hackers, not so much in this talk, but I've done other talks where I basically try to infuse, no matter how passionate you are in this stuff that we do, don't forget to have a life. Take some time off. If you were in here earlier before my slides, were projecting, you might have seen a picture of a fireplace and a rocking chair. That's a cabin I built in my backyard. So when I want to get away, I really go out and unplug. And of course, nowadays with smartphones, I can take it with me, but I like to get time to relax. This summer, I managed to marry off the last of my 4 children. So my wife and I are sort of empty nesters, long story. But this is my entire family, 4 children, all married. I have 3 grandchildren, so I'm a grandpa. I lived a life. I was raising a family while I was doing all this stuff in the industry over all these years. And also, just to try to be a little bit open, I have issues too. Anybody else with me? All right, cool. Very briefly, I give entire talks. In fact, GrrCON the last couple years is where I've given talks. One was called The Tales of the Cryptanalyst, which is where I talked more in depth about what I did in terms of cryptography back at NSA. And then the sequel was more Tales from the Cryptanalyst, which was the story of the beginning of pen testing at NSA. But I did some cool stuff in the beginning of NSA. I designed what I believe to be the first software-based encryption system that NSA produced, what I called a semi-automated one-time pad, taking the most secure communication method, which is a one-time pad, unbreakable, and learning how to do it with a computer, which I wouldn't recommend doing today, but back then it was a standalone. Windows didn't exist. It was a DOS machine. Does anybody remember? I don't even think it had a hard drive back in those days. Imagine that. I did some work with special forces. I invented this little cryptologic aid that I called the Visionnaire Cipher wheel. They called it the whiz wheel. They used it for quite a long time. There's stories about that, but that's a different talk. While I was at NSA, I was involved in sort of the operations side of the house, what most people know of NSA in terms of intercepting communications of our adversaries. I happened to be there during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, where it was like a real-world mission. So that was kind of cool. And then I mentioned earlier more Tales from the Crypt, where I go into detail. I was part of what effectively was the first penetration testing, a red team at NSA. So one of the founders, pioneers of doing that at NSA. And I have the scars on my back to prove it. Another story. So that was my government career. Came out into the private sector. And if anybody's ready for it, I did PCI. In fact, I'm still doing PCI. I've been doing that for about 15 years. And just to emphasize that I'm not your typical QSA, I think this is most of them, but these are the types of customers that I've done QSA work for as a PCI. Anybody do PCI? Anybody want to own up to it or have to do it? Yeah, quite a few more hands. So I've worked with payment processors. I've worked with the major brands, big retailers, and I have their permission to say this, by the way. But like the TJX companies, they were breached back in 2007, 2008, and after that, they hired my company, and I ended up being their QSA for about 6 years. You might recognize some of the other names up there. Heartland Payment Systems, the first major payment processor that was breached. Same hackers as TJX. So I've been very fortunate to have a lot of really cool experiences in the government and also out in the private sector. But going back to oops, sorry about that. Scratch my nose and not talk. Going back to my very first experience in security, I mentioned I started my first paying job in 1984. I had a summer internship at a naval research organization back in Maryland, which is where I'm from, called the Naval Surface Weapons Center. My job for the summer was I was working for a physicist that worked in the field of anti-submarine warfare. And he was a research scientist, very smart gentleman, way smarter than me. And over his career, he had amassed a whole lot of collection of data, books, reports, research papers, and things like that. And he had them stored in a 4 or 5 drawer. I think his was actually might have been a 5 drawer. If you're into lock picking, you probably know exactly what locks on there and stuff like that. But my job was he had gotten some money and was able to go out and get one of these newfangled desktop computers. And I'm pretty sure I found a picture of the actual computer that he had gotten his hands on. And he had bought a database programming package called DBase 2. Anybody remember DBase 2? And my job was to catalog everything that was in this safe for the entire summer and create some sort of rudimentary, learn how to use DBase and create a database searching tool. So he had some sort of catalog and some sort of idea of all this information that he had in this safe. One of the most disturbing things about that experience was I was pulling stuff out of that safe that he had checked out of like the research library of this facility before I was born. So it was weird. It's like, wow, I'm holding a book that's been in here my entire life. Anyway, so my first experience was, I'll sort of let you guys read this. I don't like to read slides, but the long and short of it was I left the safe unlocked one night. And being a young college student, sort of, remember when you were young and you knew all the answers and you were smarter than everybody else? I was kind of one of those kind. I thought, what's the big deal? I left the safe unlocked. And in discussing this with my boss and with the security people, I raised the question, we're in a facility that's got fences with barbed wire around it, so we have this secure perimeter. And the building itself, you have to go through a security checkpoint to get in. And even the office that we were in was locked. So not anybody could get into A, the campus, B, the building, C, the actual office, yet alone get to the safe. And they even had guards that would walk the halls. And in fact, they were very bored at night and they would go into each of these locked offices to see who had left the safes open and get them in a lot of trouble. I didn't think it was a big deal. My boss thought it was a huge deal because I had blemished his immaculate record that he had had over 25, 30 years. So I didn't learn the lesson then. I've learned it much more later in life that security, at least in its earliest forms, or the way we used to think of it, was primarily about securing data, is the first point. And B, it sort of necessarily involves many, many layers or many different practices or processes all working together. And part of the design is if any one fails, hopefully that's not a complete failover. Of course, that's been completely solved in our industry today, and there are no single points of failure anywhere in the world. But over the years, and especially the last couple years that I've been more active sort of in the hacker security community, going out to lots of conferences, hearing lots of people talk, it's been nagging at me that we collectively don't seem to be doing much better than we were doing back in the beginning. In some ways, maybe we're doing worse. So to sum that up, I say I think we have a problem. I think we have several problems, but we're only going to focus. We only have so much time here. I think one of the problem is, with all the technology that we have, we have sort of unfair expectations. We think things are, because they are so fast and so cool, kick them. Of course, he technically wasn't here to get the warning, so I guess that's bad. And I know him, it's okay. We've created this whole new society and this whole new way of communicating, this whole new way of interacting using all this whiz-bang technology, and yet we're not solving, or we've forgotten or failed to or never have solved this fundamental data security problem. This is also part of the problem. Which I would sum up as, some of you are slower readers than others. Everybody got it now? And there's layers to this, even in this, this funny little, I don't know what you call that. I guess we can call it a meme, but, there's egos at play, and there's, let's say, expectations in play that are not, universally agreed upon by all participants. Let's put it that way. There seems to be no end to vulnerabilities that are introduced, discovered, exposed, some worse than others. If you keep up with them at all, you know that there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there. That's kind of what we're all immersed in this community, which is what I'm getting to, is what I want to talk more in depth about. But for me, the bottom line is, for all the stuff that we're doing, there's continuing to be these tremendous failures. And as somebody that's been in the business a long time and now is in a position where I'm trying to educate and teach and try to, expand how we do security, a better understanding of it, this frustrates me. It almost embarrasses me. It depresses me that things are as bad as they are. It also depresses me that I have a really hard time keeping this slide current. Because I updated this just in the last couple of days, and these are people that either have been in the news because they've been breached or they're getting their settlements done, but this is all basically from the last month or so. And look at the names that are up there. I find it disturbing. Another part of the problem is in our rush to be advanced and be technologically savvy, we've tried to explain everything in minute detail. I apologize if you can't read this, but actually this is better resolution than I usually see. Thanks, Adrian. This is somebody's attempt to sort of carve up everything that a CISO has to worry about. And I've only recently learned to pronounce CISO because Bruce Potter corrected me last weekend. I was at another conference where he was keynoting. But these are, 12, 13, 14 different major topic areas, and under each one it divides and conquers. And it's a fairly comprehensive and decent list of all the things that we have to worry about as CISOs, or I would submit to you as security professionals. But I look at this and I'm like, gosh, I've been in this business for 30 some odd years. And while I understand what all these things are, or the vast majority of what these things are, I would never begin to claim that I'm an expert on all of this. And if I can't stare at this thing and say, I got all this, I don't know how, and this is not supposed to be propping me up, but just because I'm old and I've been doing this a long time, for those that are younger and haven't been in this business as long as I have, how does anybody keep up with all this? So, what I want to propose, and really this talk is intended to be a discussion starter. I want you guys to talk amongst yourselves, talk to me if you have the opportunity, talk to yourself, ask questions. Can we think about, is there something that we can do differently, or are we thinking about this problem correctly? So that's sort of the goal as I sort of expand on what I want to talk about today. And disregard this, pay attention. Just as a little lesson in history, when I first started at NSA, I learned a story, and now that we have Google, I could actually look up the source. But back when the United States was thinking about putting together an organization such that NSA is today, which I think was back more like around World War I, there was political controversy. There was a lot of people that didn't think that our country needed to do something like have an organization that was involved in spying and stealing secrets and stuff, because this gentleman was quoted, he's some sort of politician, gentlemen don't read each other's mail. And that was something that was like on a plaque in some office that I first started in NSA. But that's sort of, an historical perspective on the mentality of how things were back then. So, here's what I want to submit to you, accept it or not. Feel free to disagree with me. That's fine. But the way I learned it back when I was in the DoD working for NSA is we're really at the end of the day mostly concerned about what used to be called data security. There are new things now that we worry about because we have new technology that creates more problems, but mostly what we're still talking about is the protection of data. And classically, how we look at data protection or data security is divided into three aspects. Hopefully most of you guys, if not all, are familiar with they call the data triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are sort of the three things that we worry about when it comes to data. Keeping secrets, keeping the stuff that we want to keep secret away from the people that we don't want to know about it, or protecting the integrity of the data, making sure the data hasn't been altered in any way, modified in any way, making sure it's real, and making sure it's available to us. Again, you can argue, and I'm happy to concede, that the use of technology and the internet and all this stuff that we do now has perhaps introduced some different ways of viewing data. But from a classical perspective, most of what we care about is this. So the problems, I may know what movie that's from? Sneakers. Part of the problem is now it's not so much that, well, it is the problem that we have so much information, and because we want to share it freely and stream it and make it available immediately, no matter what device we have, no matter where we are, we've got this problem where there's just a proliferation of data all over the place, and no longer is it locked in a 4 or 5 drawer safe in a locked office in a locked building on a locked fenced campus. And, the movie Sneakers, which came out in 1992, do the math, that's 27 years ago. Anybody not seen it in the room? All right, so semi-spoiler alert. The subject of the movie is there's these 2 guys that in college were hackers, and they were breaking into things mostly for fun and a little bit for profit. And at one point, sort of the preamble to the movie, they get caught. One goes to prison, the other gets away. Robert Redford gets away, and he starts a company that does a lot of the companies that are vendors here today. They do penetration testing. They do physical penetration testing, trying to test the security of companies, banks, and things like that to see how well they hold up, see how well their security is. So there's this scene where the 2 finally meet. They're sort of adversaries, but they used to be best friends. And the bad guy, Ben Kingsley, says to the good guy, and I will quote, "There's a war out there, old friend, a world war. And it's not about who's got the most bullets. It's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think, it's all about the information." 1992. I would submit that's pretty much still it today. Agreed? So, by the way, that thing that they were sitting on, which was a mock-up, happened to be a model of what used to be a supercomputer called the Cray. This is a picture of one, and it's actually one of the supercomputers that I used to work on at the National Security Agency, which now you can find at the National Cryptologic Museum outside of Fort Meade in Maryland. So, yes, it's very comforting to know that the things that I worked on are in museums. And somebody at a talk I gave a while back said, "You ought to be in the museum." And I can't disagree with that. Here's my opinion. Technology alone, and I qualify the alone, will never solve the problem. Technology is the problem, in my mind. I'm an old-timer. I don't like technology. True confession. One of my early lessons at NSA, around the time when I was trying to come up with this software-based crypto system, because NSA had never done software before. In fact, I had people say, well, there's really, I think it was the same guy actually, he said, there's really no such thing as software, because all we do is hardware. All we do is firmware. NSA in those days built little black boxes, and engineers and computer scientists and mathematicians put all sorts of really cool stuff inside of them, and I can't tell you what's inside of them, because that's the point. And the idea of doing something in software was just foreign. So, but one of the early lessons was, and one of the reasons why NSA was reticent to sort of move into this digital age, was the more you relied on, and in the early days it was machines and boxes, anything beyond the one-time pad, anything that can be created by man can be broken by man. And I think most would agree that that's pretty much still the case. No matter what cryptographic algorithms we're talking about, and I'm not a mathematician, and if you are, you can disagree with me, that's fine. But anything that you're doing with any kind of cryptography, digital, computer-based, there's always a solution. It may take you 10 billion years to get it, but theoretically, there's always a solution. And also theoretically, as a cryptologist, there's always the possibility that somebody figures out a way to do a shortcut or attack it. Or, for crying out loud, what just happened to NordVPN? Somebody just steals the key. There's always a way around it. But I guess for me, at the end of the day, and this is an attitude I've had since NSA days, no matter what you do to secure or protect or encode or encrypt your data, primarily for transmission in those days, sooner or later, somebody's going to want to decrypt it and read it. So there's always this point of vulnerability where the stuff that we used to call plain text, the data is available. And so who cares about the security of the pipe? Focus on the endpoints. I'm oversimplifying, but flip back to that slide about all the breaches. This continues to be a problem. So, in my travels the last couple years, going to lots of conferences, especially those bigger conferences that are more vendor-based that everybody here likes to hate on. Me too, sort of. But you hear these words all the time. We throw this language, this vernacular around in this thing that we call security. And we hear words like risk, and we hear words like threats, and of course vulnerabilities, the word security itself. I get frustrated very often because I'll walk through the vendor areas and I'll hear the pitches being given, and people will use these words in ways that I think, wow, they don't really understand what the word means. And I'll have conversations with people and try to get them to well, what did you mean when you say that? Or what did this word mean in your context? And of course, forgive the marketing people and the people that they hire for the booths. They're not always the practitioners, but it doesn't matter what the circumstance is. I find when you actually pin people down to actually define their terms, whatever they are, very often they struggle, which means that a lot of this terminology is being bounced around and being talked about by people that we think everybody knows what we think is the meaning of all the different terms, whether we ask them or not. And I think that in some ways contributes to the problem. The way I learned these terms in a classic approach is what was called the risk equation. And there are many risk equations out there. If you Google it, you can find all sorts of formulas. Again, I'm not a mathematician, so I don't really care about the math as much as sort of the concepts. So breaking it down as simply as I'm able to, this is a depiction of what I call the classic basic risk equation, where risk is a function of vulnerabilities and threats and countermeasures. And you'll notice security, the word, isn't even in the equation. And what it means essentially is, whatever you're caring about happening or not happening, you have some idea of a value of risk. What is the risk of doing business? What is the risk of, getting out of bed in the morning? You can apply it anywhere. And you try to quantify, well, what are all the vulnerabilities that could impact whatever it is we're worried about, that we're trying to figure out what our risk level is. And then what are the threats, and so on and so forth. Quite simply, I try to make it a math problem, just addition, but vulnerabilities, you have some value, plus threats, some other value. You subtract off whatever you're doing in terms of countermeasure or mitigation, or for the sake of argument, let's say security. You subtract that down, and therefore the risk, whatever the number is lower. And again, I'm not so concerned with coming up with real values, but just conceptually, we all know that we want the risk number to be lower. How low? Who knows? What's the threshold? Who knows? We just know it needs to be lower. And I think in our industry, and I could be again oversimplifying this, and feel free to disagree, but as I look at this equation, I think a lot of people think the easiest way to reduce risk is to reduce vulnerabilities. It's like the one variable that's like the easiest one to control or manipulate. That's my theory. If you have other ideas, that's great. We can talk about it. But I think, and if you think about our industry, we seem to be fixated on vulnerabilities. That seems to be the emphasis of most of this industry, whether we're the security researchers, the hackers, the pen testers, the vendors, the products, whatever. We all seem to be fixated on, driving down the vulnerabilities. To a lesser degree, the threats. Vulnerabilities, the way I learned it, is basically... That's acceptable. I am a family man after all. Vulnerabilities, the way I learned, was simply a weakness, and the weakness could be in a product, in an application, in a process. It's just simply a weakness in its most basic form. some examples. Threats, and this is an interesting one, and it may just be me, but the way I originally learned what threats were is the threats are the people. The threats are the bad guys. They're the actual enemies that are trying to defeat you on the battlefield, that are trying to steal your secrets, and so on and so forth. So I have a really hard time when I hear people talking about threat in the context of what I used to call attacks. It's just me, but bear with me because I'm trying to pull this all together eventually. Countermeasures then is mitigations. It's what you can do to protect against or to minimize the impact of the fact that there's vulnerabilities or threats vulnerabilities in your environment or threats to your environment. Okay? The source for this, and this is something that you can find on the internet. It's gone through several updates over the years to update the terminology to fit with all the new stuff that we do. And I think even this is not the version that I learned, because this one that I found is dated 2000. The one that I had, I think it was originally published back in the 80s, and it was originally called the National Information Systems Security ComSec. We used to call it Communication Security before we called it Information Security. But this was sort of my Bible, reference manual when I was at NSA. This is where I went for the authoritative answers and definitions of things. So in this, and I'm using the somewhat updated version, but in this document, the source, as far as I'm concerned, at least from a DoD perspective, risk is defined as follows. I won't read it to you. Unless anybody wants me to read it to you. Okay. And this is the definition of threat, which begins to take into account it's not just people, but it's stuff that people do to you, especially because a lot of attacks these days don't require an actual attacker, breaking into your computer, breaking into your network. They can just launch stuff kind of randomly. But here's an interesting thing. This is a slide that I pulled from a deck. I've been doing consulting for many years, and this goes back a little over 20 years. Where back in those days we were trying to talk to companies about how they needed to build security programs and why, and trying to explain how it all worked. And so we pulled together this slide about what the threats are to companies, to organizations, and why they do the things. I look at this today and I kind of think, are we missing anything? This is still pretty much the case. Which again, we've been doing this for a long time and nothing seems to change. Vulnerability then, the definition again, at the end of the day, it's a weakness, but weakness in anything associated with what it is that you're doing. But I keep coming back to the vulnerabilities. We're fixated on the vulnerabilities, and this is a couple years old slide, but these were kind of big deal vulnerabilities because they got their own logos. That's a clear sign. But to me, more importantly, several of these vulnerabilities, when they were discovered, were existing in the things that they were running in for 10, 15, 20 years. And that kind of bothers me because, at any given moment, anything that we use and trust, some smart person somewhere can have this epiphany and discover some new vulnerability that's been there forever. The good news is they're not very often exploited, but very often they are. So it continues to be a problem. In case you don't believe me, I actually have some empirical evidence here. I happened to find an article a month or so ago. It came out several months ago. I saw it more recently. But some study was done where they tried to catalog all the vulnerabilities that are known, like in the CVE database, and actually count them up based on actual attack scenarios, breaches that we've known about, and they discovered, take their word for it, but those are kind of the numbers that came up where all these vulnerabilities that we're dealing with all the time, actually very few of them are actually used in exploits. Why? Because people still use default passwords, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the last element, countermeasure. Again, maybe we could substitute the word security, but it's the things you do to minimize, to mitigate, to offset not the existence of vulnerabilities or threats, but the fact that they're present, that you can't really drive it down. So My question then, that's the question, but let me put the slide back up again. And this is a slightly different version of the risk equation because I tried to make this more of a commercial model. Whereas where I learned the risk equation in the DoD, what was at risk was essentially human life. Whether it was soldiers on the battlefield, our troops, our citizens abroad, our state departments, our diplomats, and things like that. Everything we do within this umbrella of national security ostensibly is to protect human life at one level or another. Whereas in a business context, in the commercial world, it really boils down to some sort of value. I mean, we're in this business and we like to think about, perfect security, whatever that is. We'll get back to that in a minute. But everything comes at a cost. There's a cost associated with everything we do, driving down this perceived risk, which I would submit to you in a business sense, we really only care about at the end of the day one of two risks: the ability to make money and how much is it going to cost us to run our business. There can be variations. Again, I'm not setting this in stone. I'm just trying to, broadly describe this. But here's my question. And, I've asked this to a lot of people. 2 years ago, I was hung up on vulnerabilities and I went around and asked people that I would meet at conference, well, what is a vulnerability? And watch them struggle to define it. And then for a while, I was going around and doing the same thing with threat and so on and so forth. But here's my supposition this time around. And again, I'm not a mathematician, so if you are, feel free to correct me, but bear with me for a minute. If you have a math function where you have elements, or what we call variables, in an equation, generally those variables are expressed as separate variables because they're different. You with me so far? So, if in this equation, if we assume that countermeasure is more or less what we're talking about when we talk about security, because it's a separate element, because it's a separate variable, and there's other variables that are called vulnerabilities, and there's other variables that are called threats, in my mind, that kind of means that vulnerabilities and threats aren't security. So my question to you is, if all this stuff that we do in our industry that associates or fixates or has something to do with vulnerabilities, if by definition, if you go back to this risk equation, isn't anything to do with security, then what is it that we're doing here? Title of the talk. Same question asking about threats. If all that we're doing in this industry of revolving around threats, however we define them, are by definition not security related because security is a separate variable, then what is it that we're doing? My question is, if it's not security, maybe it's just our job. Because I'm not saying the stuff that we're doing isn't important. I'm just suggesting maybe it's not security. So the question then becomes, what is security? What is security if it's not running around trying to discover vulnerabilities and eliminate them in your environment, drive them down, control them, patch them, fix them? What if all the patching and secure configurations and monitoring your users, what if all that is just the way you run your business? What then is security? And if all this stuff we're doing is not technically security, and I apologize, Dave, I forgot to start with your thing, but we'll get to it. Commercial moment, because I just remembered it. Sorry, Dave. Gentleman in the front row, Dave Schwartzberg, runs an organization called Hack for Kids. It's a charitable organization that tries to teach young people hacking skills so we can keep this thing going. They put out a card game about 2 years ago now called Freaker Life, which is an educational, interactive fantasy card collecting game, stuff that I don't do, I'm too old. But it's designed to teach you the history of hacking and phreaking throughout the years from the 70s and 80s and 90s. So there's lots of historical information in it. Also in the deck are a couple face cards that have special values, wild cards in the deck. And I was fortunate enough to be selected to be one of the original what they call anachronisms. So They have a booth here today. Go by and buy the whole decks, but we're actually I'm going to let Dave do it when I'm done talking, auction off. And where do the proceeds of the auction go to? Benefit Hack for Kids. So we're going to auction this off at the conclusion of my talk. If anybody's interested in an autographed copy of my anachronism card, it's up here. We'll get back to that. So that's our commercial interruption. So what are we doing here? If all the stuff that we're doing at some level isn't really security at all, and I'm asking us to think about it and question this, and I'm not saying that there's a right answer. I'm not suggesting that I have the right answer, but I'm asking that we think about it. What is this? What are we doing here? If it's something to do with security, but it's not, or maybe security is something else that we haven't tried with. All for the purpose of, and my belief is, all the new stuff that we try to do doesn't really work ultimately, or isn't working, or we don't have a good track record of it. And maybe, just maybe, there's still something to be learned from the ancient history of how data security used to be done. And maybe there's something still there to extend into this new environment, this new technological world that we live in. I don't have the answer. The older I get, the more questions I have. But I continue to be unsettled at companies continue to be breached. And the more and more people I talk to or I hear speak at conferences throw these terms around and very clearly, at least to me, don't seem to have a fundamental understanding of what they are, especially when they use one variable term to define what another variable term is. It doesn't work that way. They all are just different and distinct, although they are all related. So my charge to you is to think, question, keep talking, have the conversation amongst yourselves, have it with me, but do something. If you're at all interested or intrigued about what I'm saying, want to learn more, I just try to teach and share information experiences. Many of you probably know this already. I'm one of the co-hosts on Paul's Security Weekly. Been doing that for the last 5 years or so. I'm not on it every week. In fact, we're recording in about 2 hours, and I'm not going to be on it today. Sorry. But I'm still not convinced whether I'm being punished and put in a corner or whether I'm being rewarded, because if any of you listen or watch the show, I very often bring up PCI because I've been doing it for so long. But they've decided to spin up a new show, so we've started recording just in the last month a new show called Security and Compliance Weekly, where we're exploring, amongst other things, how to bridge the gap between these worlds within our security industry that do security and do compliance and think they're two separate different things that don't play well together. I've lived in both worlds, and I think we both do the same thing, and we just don't know it. So we're trying to foster a conversation in this podcast to try to, at the end, make sure our companies and our customers are more secure, and doing it by figuring out how to work together and play well together, and ultimately sit and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, as my wife would like to say. There's a company called Cybrary.io. They do a lot of free education videos. I recorded a training course on there a couple years ago called The Art of the Jedi Mind Trick. It's maybe a 2-hour course at the end of the day, just going over some of the lessons I learned in my years of consulting of how to foster communication, how to speak to your audience, which is obviously what I'm doing now. But anytime you're talking to somebody, you're speaking to an audience. In our context, very often we're selling something, whether we're trying to sell a product or trying to convince our management, our bosses, or customers to spend money, or trying to convince people to change their behaviors, do something different. We're selling something. So, we're trying to compel people to take an action, which is a particular type of speech you can learn about in my course. I was very privileged earlier in the year to be part of a book that came out called Tribe of Hackers. Anybody hear of Tribe of Hackers? Excellent. A second edition came out, Red Team. They also let me be in that one as well, since I used to do pen testing at NSA. That's sort of it gets me places, I guess. Those books, if you're not familiar with them, they talk to a bunch of different people and ask them all the same questions. So we basically filled out a survey in the original book. It's like, what's the best thing about the business? What's the worst thing about the business? What's your favorite hacker movie? What would you change if you could change anything? What are the lessons learned that you want to impart to people? It's a really fascinating read because especially in the first book, it's a very diverse set of people that I didn't know most of the people in the book, honestly, but they're all people that have made a name for themselves in one of the many silos that create this whole cybersecurity industry. Oops, I said cyber. I try to get through the whole talk without using that word. Drink. But it's a very interesting read, at least to me it was, because there's a lot of diversity, people coming at it from the different place and very often coming to the same conclusion. Because I think there is a way to approach this that more of us need to know. If you want to know what that is, go read the book and see if you can figure out what it is. I have time for a few questions or comments. Anybody want to say, Jeff, you're crazy. Go away. How much time total do we have left? Okay, perfect. Any questions, comments, anyone? Otherwise, get your wallets out. I'm sorry. Oh, right over there. Sorry. Yes. I know the person that gave the talk, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. I've asked the question of many people, especially speakers and people that are well-known, SANS instructors, what is security? And even people that are sort of the upper echelon struggle with defining it. I have typically defined security as an illusion. I was talking to someone this summer, and I liked their response. They defined security as a feeling. So how many people are more comfortable because they have to take their shoes off when they go through security at the airport? I mean, how many people feel like they're more safe on the airplane? A lot of security, it is kind of selling a peace of mind, if you will, not necessarily doing anything. And yet, there's a lot of stuff that we do that do actually do a lot of good things, and very often, we don't see it because nothing bad has happened. It's one of the paradoxes of this industry is lots of companies out there are doing great things and they're not getting breached, or at least not famously, and they get by, and so everything's good. But one little bad thing happens and it's exposed to how bad things are, and that's what we dwell on. At the end of the day, all these companies that are breached are victims of crime, and to be frank, the only other thing that I think is a parallel in terms of how we treat victims of data breaches is victim of sex crimes, where we so often sort of, focus on the victim and demonize the victim, and, there's equivalencies there. Why wasn't the company doing this? Why was that person in that place? What's their past behaviors? So, I do sort of agree, but not completely, because I think there's more to it than that. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes. I'll put it to you this way. It used to be said that necessity is the mother of invention. That's a saying that my parents, who grew up in the Depression, taught me. And I think most of us would agree that somewhere along the line, technology sort of lapped the necessity. We've invented and created things that are really cool, but then we've gone out and tried to find a place to use them. So my question to you is, if it's not a necessity, is it still innovation? Any other questions? All right, Dave, quick, come do the auction. Thank you very much, bud.
Yep, great. Thank you. Can you do that? No. Yeah. So, wait, you can't leave? What's up with that? So, just... Oh, there's the hook.
Stickers.
So start the bidding. $5. $5 for Jeff Mann's face in your pocket. $5 for Jeff. Did I see a hand go up? $5? Anybody want to double that to 10? Did I just volunteer you for 10? Who would like to take that higher to 15? 15 for Jeff Mann's face in your pocket. 20. $20 for Jeff Mann's face in your 20? You got 20. You want to make 25? 25. Now who wants to go to 30? Right now this man's winning with $25 for Jeff Mann's face in his pocket. Anybody want to beat him? 30? 30? No, you don't want to do 30? 30 over here. 25? 25 going once. 30? 30! Woo! We got a war going on. $30 for Jeff Mann's face in your pocket. We'd like to take it to 35. How much? 35. $35. You want to bring it to 40? $40 for Jeff Mann's face in your pocket, man. How many people get to say that today? You. $40. Going once. Was it 35? That's what your bid? You want to do 40? She did 40. Oh! All right. Go once. Twice. Sold to the lady in the front row. But do not leave yet. Congratulations. Sir.